Thank you so much for joining me for our lecture here on Chapter 2 of our Lead Lab text. So we're going to get started with taking a look at some of the ways that you can determine your own leadership style, as well as some personality traits and different things. And when you better understand yourself and you better understand other people, sometimes it makes it a little bit easier to be a more effective leader. So we start out with a quote from Sir Winston Churchill saying, "Personally, I'm always ready to learn, although I do not always like being taught." And that's something a lot of us can probably, commiserate with. Sometimes it's hard to hear that difficult feedback, or it's hard to be uncomfortable as you develop skills in some certain area. But those are the times when you are really learning. And so if you can get over that liking to be taught and seeing the value in it, it can be really a benefit in your own growth. So our learning objectives today are to name and describe 4 assessments related to leadership, explain your own personality type, leadership style, principles, and foundational skills, informed by the leadership and leadership related assessment instruments. Now, I did put a leadership assessment on your module for this week. I don't have access to all these different types, but there is one up there that you can get started with. And then if you wanted to do some internet searches, you might be able to find some other free ones to investigate your own leadership and personality type a little bit more thoroughly. You're going to produce results of at least 4 leadership related assessments if you can access those. If not, if you just do the one, I'm okay with that. Identify and distinguish your leadership style, principles, and foundational skills, and really kind of define what it means to have those particular skills, strengths, weaknesses, and styles. You're also going to use the data from your self-assessment to devise kind of a plan. You don't have to write anything out at this time, but just kind of look at it as a plan to improve on your weaknesses and leveraging your strengths, getting to know yourself a little bit better. Think of how you can implement those strengths to make yourself a better leader. Okay, so to know what kind of leader you are, first of all, you have to know yourself. So to know yourself, sometimes we can find it a little bit difficult to be brutally self-reflective. And so that's where some of these assessments come in really handy, because they can give us the data that we may not see in ourselves. So all leaders, regardless of their natural abilities, experience, education, and training, should be aware of their own personal areas where they need improvement and where they're strong. So nobody is too good to grow. We all have improvements to make, and no matter what your level is, we should always be looking for ways to grow and improve, and that's what's going to make us become more successful. So as you're trying to figure out who you are as a leader and you're trying to improve yourself, you have to think about what kind of leader you are. Are you, depending on the leadership type that you gravitate towards, maybe as you gravitate towards one direction, maybe it takes you away from another direction, so you need to build up that other direction. What are your strengths and your weaknesses, and are you aware of how those strengths and weaknesses contribute to your leadership style? And so it's really getting to know yourself and optimizing what you're good at, and yet building the things that you need work on. Okay, so we're going to go over a number of different tests, but one of the popular tests was developed at Baylor University, and it's called the VARK test. And this is basically a learning profile. So this VARK test is going to score an individual as having a predisposition or propensity for learning through certain constructs. So, a lot of us are always already aware of how we learn. We may not have the terminology to describe it, but we can be visual, auditory or hearing, reading and writing, or kinesthetic doing learners. And so through this assessment, you can be ranked and you can see what you're strongest in, and then recognize that that's your strongest in, that's your strongest form of learning. Maybe that's where you want to put a lot of your time because you feel like you get the best gains there. However, when you go out into the workforce, or when you're in a different program, or as you continue your education, we all have to be aware that just because that's our learning personality or our learning comfort zone, that not everything is set up for to cover each of these particular areas. So it's good to know what you gravitate towards, and then it's important to realize that you can improve the other areas with extra effort. So if you scored really high on kinesthetic, that's great. You can do amazing things. You can really, operate your transducer. You are really good with your knobology on your equipment. But if you are really low in oral and reading and writing, you may have difficulty passing your board exams or listening to a patient history. And so we're going to gravitate towards one area, but it's important to also look at the areas we're not as strong in and try to build those up. And not expect to only grow through our one area of comfort. So when you start to understand your own personality, learning style, and things like that better, you start to actually recognize those types of qualities in other people as well. So understanding personalities in yourself can help you understand the personalities of subordinates, peers, superiors, any of your colleagues in the healthcare system. And that can really be a benefit in helping you see people's potential and helping you empathize more with people, helping you maybe present materials that are going to be more effective at teaching or helping others in their growth. So it can really not only help grow yourself, but it can help you be a better leader and motivator, and provide you with extra empathy towards other people when you start to understand their styles as well. So there's another, we talked about the VARK test, and then there's a leadership and personality self-assessment, which the goal of these leadership and personality self-assessments are to answer a bunch of questions with the goal of trying to find out how you can better know yourself. So knowing thyself as a healthcare leader will help you identify how to leverage your strengths while trying to improve and address your weaknesses. And remember, no matter how far along you are in the career, there's always going to be weaknesses. So never stop looking for those and finding ways to continue improvement. One type of assessment that we can take is for emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence is very important. Sometimes it's a hard thing to define, but you know when somebody has it, and you, more importantly, know when somebody doesn't have it. So they started doing studies about emotional intelligence maybe back in the 70s or 80s, and they found 4 different constructs of emotional intelligence where people could either do really well, or really have some areas for growth. So the first one is self-awareness. Are we aware of ourselves and how we're coming across? How are people perceiving us? How are we really acting? Self-management, that would be how we're controlling ourselves. Are we able to, feel those moments of anger and yet still manage our presentation of ourselves in those times? Social awareness, how are other people around us feeling? How are we making them feel? Things like that. And then social skills, how are we able to interact with other people? So these are all really important components of emotional intelligence. So by taking an assessment, you might see areas where you're stronger, areas where you're weaker. And if we're going to always try to improve, identifying areas where we can put that effort is always going to benefit us. Okay, now you've probably heard of left brain, right brain thinkers, and that is a personality assessment called hemisphere dominance, referring to the hemispheres of our cerebrum. So hemisphere dominance is an assessment that determines which brain hemisphere is more dominant or more progressive. So in right-brained individuals, so those that test and demonstrate that their right-brained is more dominant, they're typically best suited for creating new things, maybe creating new products, service lines. These might be people in a hospital that are really good for developing protocols or creating a marketing plan, things like that. These are the people that are really the why, that sometimes they're the more visionaries, where they can see and create and develop. Now, left brain individuals are usually more detail oriented. They're typically more methodical, they're better at calculating, and they prefer to take the big plan and implement the little details. So if we refer this back to how it relates to start with why, that could be your how person. They're going to take that big idea, they're going to look for the little details. These are the people that are going to find your missing commas, your extra spaces in sentences, whereas the right-brained individuals may be the person that produces the overall plan for the left-brained individual to implement. And again, these are slightly overgeneralizations, but it kind of gives you an idea. Okay, Jungian assessments. It's a funny name, Jungian, but it's named after a developer, Mr. Jung. So this type of assessment, scholars suggest that all individuals are born with certain personality archetypes or predispositions, and we can test for what those predispositions are with certain tests, one of them being Myers-Briggs type indicator, or the MBTI. And the interesting thing they've found about the MBTI is that the results of the MBTI remain fairly stable throughout a person's career. So where we might see emotional intelligence areas change and grow and develop, or even maybe go the opposite direction sometimes, with the MBTI, it really seems to stay stable, where the strengths stay your strengths, the weaknesses stay your weaknesses, and so on and so forth. So these MBTI assessments can basically, they're going to put you into different groups. So the first group it's going to look at is, it's going to say, are you an extrovert or an introvert? So this is something most of us are pretty familiar with, so I didn't put a lot of detail here. But you know, that extrovert person, they're going to be filled up by being out in public. That's going to be what makes them feel fulfilled. An introvert is going to be filled up when they feel they've had their own quiet time and had their own time for self-reflection and things like that. So most of us would fall into one of those categories, or some of us can be a little bit in between. So so that is part of the Jungian assessment. The second part would be evaluating whether the person is sensing or intuitive. A person that is more sensing usually makes decisions off of historical data. So they're going to be that person that doesn't want to jump to a conclusion and make a decision. They're going to want to do a little bit of research, see what happened in the past. They might be really affected by previous experiences. Intuition is going to be trusting more in their innate intuition, just like the term suggests. So they may ignore the past data, they may ignore past experiences and go with what they think or feel is going to happen. Then we have another way to classify people, which would be thinking or feeling. So the thinking person is, they value logic, they look at cause and effect, and they can be very good at execution. Whereas the feeling person is a little bit more concerned with emotion and their impact of decisions, and they are typically better at interactions with colleagues. And then we have the judging or perceiving. So most people will fall into one of these groups, where judging would be somebody that likes to weigh all the options and look at all alternatives before making a decision. Whereas the perceiving person is really going to have confidence that they know what they're doing and the decision they make is going to be the right one. So they're typically more spontaneous actors. So you can see, if I go down this list, you know, if you try and group yourself into one or the other, you'll probably kind of notice some patterns. So, or you might even wonder, like, well, some days I'm an introvert, some days I'm an extrovert, some days I feel like I've sensed more, or some days I work more off of intuition, and that's not abnormal, but it's kind of on a sliding scale, but you're going to typically tend more towards one archetype than the other. Okay, so kind of look through this list, try to identify if you're an extra or introvert, if you're sensing or intuitive, if you're thinking or feeling, and try and identify what your natural state is, or comfort. Okay, we've all heard of type A and type B personality indicators. And so this is another type of test for your personality. So type A individuals, if you test it as a type A here, they're typically more competitive, inquisitive. However, they get easily bored with routine. They can have a short fuse, often feel impatient, and may be aggressive. They have a higher intensity and usually have a higher rate of burnout. So if you're working with somebody that is very type A, knowing that these are normal qualities that they may have might help you work better with them, offsetting some of the weaker areas while encouraging some of the more positive areas. Type B individuals, however, are the direct opposite. They're more easily relaxed. They can maintain focus on activities for longer periods of time. They envision stability as comforting, and they can be perceived as more social and more easygoing. And then there's the individuals that present with a combination of both characteristics, which I would suspect most of us do. I know I certainly do. And some of us might just have qualities of an A and a B all the time. Others can be able to switch between more of a type A and a type B personality depending on the occasion or the circumstance. Okay, now we briefly talked about the VARK test. This is determining how what your learning style is. So we're just going to break that down just a little bit more now. So the VARK test, that's assessment that tells us our learning style. Again, it's really important to not expect that moving forward in your career that there's going to be opportunity to learn just by your learning style. So we really need to look at this, really optimize our learning style. When we're doing our self-studies, we're going to be utilizing our learning style because it's most efficient. But when we're learning from other people or we're attending a class or a conference, realize that not every experience is going to be directed towards our particular style, so that we need to build up the styles that we're not as strong in. So visual learners, a lot of us fall into this category. We're going to prefer picture graphs. These are the ones when you're supposed to be reading your textbook, you're flipping for the next picture and reading every detail under the picture. You like flow charts. You like to organize your thoughts in a visual pattern. Things that distract you would be debates, discussions, decisions, anything that takes you away from your focus in that visual moment. Oral learners are listeners. They're stimulated by conversation. They like discussion. They like verbal decision making or talking things out, thinking out loud. These are people that are going to learn really well in lecture. But they might have trouble with reading. They might have trouble learning from pictures, but they might listen and absorb everything. So they say that to be, when you get to the graduate level where everything is lecture based and discussion based, that's where the oral learners really seem to thrive. Whereas, visual learners might do really great in different art classes or things where they have, again, like the flow charts and things to really break things down, providing them visual experiences. Then we have reading and writing learners, which some people tell me all the time, well, I only learn when I write my notes. I learn from writing notes, from making note cards. That's how I learn. That's going to be your reading and writing learner. They like reading. They write summaries. They organize their thoughts as they write. And so a lot of these learners will do well with complex tasks and multitasking. They're going to be good writing communicators typically. They're going to be able to put their thoughts in writing better than they may be able to express them. However, they might have more trouble with listening, and they might have more trouble with the visual-based learning. And then there's kinesthetic learners. This is where you learn through experience. They often rapidly process information. They can be more comfortable with a little bit of ambiguity, not as many hard and fast rules. A lot of people in our areas are very kinesthetic learners. However, as you already know, that only can get you so far. You have to develop those other type of learning so that you can, perform well on board exams and studies and things like that. So what we really need is to be able to optimize all of our learning styles, be aware of which one we know serves us best, but then build up utilization of the other ones as well. Okay, there's another test called the New Enneagram Test. I didn't know what an enneagram was, but it's believed to be a natural neural tissue organization within our brains that causes a physiologic reason or predisposition for certain types of brain activity. And so these are basically anatomical parts of our brain that predict the physiology that will make us think and act in certain ways. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't ever act outside of that we're predetermined to only act one way. Of course, through nature versus nurture, we can have some control over this. So for this actual test, it's the New Enneagram Test. It's dividing or testing you into 9 different types. So the first type is the reformer. The reformer is typically a perfectionist and they're obedient. They like to maybe be in a group and work in a group, but when they're in a group, they want to dictate the group dynamics. So they want to be a little bit in control. So these are going to be pretty much, your high performers, perfectionist, obedient, they're not breaking the rules, and they're in charge. The helper is a little different. They're going to engage in more supportive relationships, and they're going to build these relationships to try and gain acceptance with less attention spent on being perfect, obedient, or in charge. Now, a motivator is a little bit more like a reformer in that they're usually a very high achiever, but rather than being so much as a perfectionist or so much as somebody who's in charge of a group, they're that high achiever that's going to try and motivate others to follow them into success. Now, romantics, on the other hand, look for warm connections. So they're more worried about the connections between people than they are really about leading, about achieving, about being perfect. So they're just really looking for connections. Okay, then we have the thinker. The thinker really needs privacy. They can easily get overstimulated. So they might be somebody that really likes maybe a homebody, likes to be in their office, likes to be at home, gets easily distracted, overstimulated in situations, and they're typically direct, sometimes lacking finesse in their communications. Then we have a skeptic. Skeptics are usually type A person. They're going to be challengers to the status quo. So they're going to be interested in investigating everything. They're often not willing to just take something at its face value. They're going to be interested in getting down to the nitty-gritty and finding out for themselves. Now the other adventurer is the next is the adventurer, which is more like a free spirit. They're going to desire excitement. They're looking for pleasure. They're looking for fun. They're not as worried about perfectionists or being obedient. They're not really as worried about connections or helping or things like that. They're really just really out for, as the name states, adventure. Now, sometimes these people will have a lot of difficulty with organizing because their minds are going elsewhere rather than being able to focus on the task at hand for organizing. Then we have leader. Leader is often left off of this list because it's considered a composite of these other modalities. So a leader may not just be one, say, reformer and romantic. They might have multiple different links that would make them a leader. And then finally we have the peacemaker. The peacemakers are typically more shy. They don't consider themselves special, but these people in very unique supportive circumstances can become extremely good employees or even leaders if they're given the opportunity to do so and the comfort to do so. Okay, so now we have the Dynamic Culture Leadership Alignment Assessment. So another assessment. Now this one is typically used to assess an actual leadership style and propensity of a leadership group or an organization. However, it can also be broken down and assess the individual as well. So some of the things that this assessment tool is going to assess is leadership, management. It can assess technical or scientific expertise, art, propensities, effectiveness in communication, effectiveness in planning, ability to make decisions and have those decisions align appropriately, create employee or how to evaluate how the institution is doing an employee enhancement, and then evaluate knowledge management constructs. So you can see from the categories here that this is more towards an organization, but it can be adjusted to assess an individual. And this is some of the ways that this dynamic culture leadership assessment could be documented with data. So they could do their measurement, and then they can plot how strong it is in leadership versus science versus management versus art, and take an overall view of where the growth needs to occur. Here's another example where their leadership and management team range of scores. So after they just tested leadership and management, they found that they're good at leadership, not very good at art, not great at management, and pretty decent at science. When they looked at leadership and management teams within the organization's operation, they saw a little bit more equality across all areas. And then when they looked at leadership and management team composite of the organization's operating environment, they found it much stronger in the science and management. They saw it less effective in the leadership and art. So in summary, research is in agreement that personality archetypes do affect leadership style, but they're not the singular determinant of it. So with like anything, leadership style can be grown and developed based off of the effort put in. However, knowing leadership style as well as personality traits are going to help you improve and develop those, as well as see them in other people so you can help colleagues improve and develop. Equally, leadership, like I mentioned, can be learned and developed, but it does take a lot more effort to develop areas where don't have a natural propensity for. In this book of Malcolm Gladwell, The Outliers, it suggests that 10,000 hours of practice, experience, trial and error, and self-discovery are required to become a master or an expert at anything, with rare exception. So you're looking at 10,000 hours, and we think that our 1,600 hours of ultrasound is going to make us an expert in ultrasound, and we have data out there that supports that. Hey, you're really not going to be an expert or a master for another probably 3 or 4 years, and that's okay. That's normal. Methods to maximize nature versus nurture leadership state of being can include education and study, experience in partaking in professional organizations, and using mentoring. So some of those areas that you don't have the natural propensity for, you can still grow, and you can use these opportunities to help grow them. So thank you so much for joining me today. I am glad that we could take a look at this together, and I hope you enjoy taking your assessment and are interested in the findings.